People who test positive for coronavirus will no longer be legally required to isolate from Thursday, Boris Johnson has announced. Free universal testing will also end in April under the Prime Minister's plan for living with COVID. The Prime Minister detailed the strategy for England to the Commons late on Monday afternoon after a cabinet disagreement thought to centre on funding for future surveillance of the virus. Those who receive a positive COVID test will still be advised to stay at home for at least 5 days, but will not be obliged to under law under the plans. Subject to parliamentary approval, routine contact tracing will also end on Thursday, as will self-isolation payments and the legal obligation for individuals to tell their employers about the requirement to isolate. Mr. Johnson also told MPs that changes to statutory sick pay and employment support allowance designed to help people through the coronavirus pandemic will end on March 24. He later told a press conference the removal of restrictions is a moment of pride for the nation. Find out how COVID-19 is affecting where you live by adding your postcode. Find out how many cases of coronavirus there have been where you live in the widget above, and get an even more detailed breakdown when you click through to our sister site in your area. 2014. Anthony Thrower, PM. End of free testing will not add to cost of living crisis. The Prime Minister rejected any assertion the removal of free tests will add to people's worries with the looming cost of living crisis. He said, "This change in the testing regime won't come through for a few weeks to come, by which time we hope and expect the incidence will have further. I hope that the impact on people will be minimal." 2006. Anthony Thrower, Sir Patrick Vallance. Celebrate in sunshine, but take an umbrella with you. Discussing the potential impact of the end of the measures, Sir Patrick said the next steps will create an important safety net for the next deadly variant. Adding an analogy from an American colleague, he said, "You can celebrate when the sun's shining, but take an umbrella with you. I think that's really the PM added, "That's an important message." 1949. Anthony Thrower, Sir Patrick Vallance. COVID will evolve over the coming years. Chief Scientific Advisor Sir Patrick Vallance says COVID will continue to evolve over the next couple of years and he cannot guarantee future variants will be less severe than Omicron. He told the press conference it was essential to maintain a virus surveillance system, the capacity to ramp up measures again quickly and to protect the. He added, "This pandemic is not over. The virus is continuing to evolve. It will continue to do so quite fast probably for the next couple of years. There is no guarantee that the next variant is as reduced severity as Omicron. As it evolves, what it is trying to do is to transmit more readily. The change in severity is a random byproduct. We expect there to be further variants and they could be more severe." 1943. Anthony Thrower, Whitty. We expect winters to be tricky. Professor Whitty says the removal of restrictions is not a sudden step but the gradual removal back to normality. But he added next winter could again cause issues for the NHS. He said, "As the good news is things are going down as we head into spring. Do have to accept the respiratory season next winter and subsequent winters is likely to combine COVID, flu and all the other respiratory problems." 1933. Anthony Thrower, Whitty warns next COVID variant could be worse than Omicron as PM axes rules. England's Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty says the country could yet face another COVID variant worse than Omicron. He added the number of people with the deadly variant is still very high, and he did not rule out worse to come. Professor Whitty said, "We could certainly end up with something that is more likely to lead to hospitalizations than Omicron. The number of people with Omicron would have been higher if people had not been careful not to transfer it to others. This would have been a lot worse." Despite the removal of restrictions from Thursday, he said public health advice is people with COVID should still self-isolate. 1923. Anthony Thrower, PM. Today is not the day we can declare COVID victory. Boris Johnson described the nation's development of vaccines as possibly the greatest national effort in peacetime history. The PM earlier announced to the nation the plans for removing the legal requirement to self-isolate if testing positive for COVID. He added, "It is not the day to declare victory, but it is the day to restore our liberties in full." He said, "Today is not the day we can declare victory over COVID because this virus is not going away. But it is the day when all the efforts of the last 2 years finally enable us to protect ourselves whilst restoring our liberties in full. After 2 of the darkest, grimmest years in our peacetime history, I do believe this is a moment of pride for our nation and a source of hope for all that we can achieve in the years to come." 1857. Anthony Thrower. COVID Downing Street news conference to start shortly. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Sir Chris Whitty, and Sir Patrick Vallance are about to speak at the Downing Street news conference. 1854. Anthony Thrower. Bureaucratic COVID travel form under review, says PM. The Prime Minister earlier assured the House the overseas COVID travel form is under review, amid calls from the travel industry to scrap it in time for the Easter holidays. Labour MP for Exeter Ben Bradshaw said, "Given everything else the Prime Minister said this afternoon, why is he keeping the bureaucratic and irritating passenger locator form when the whole of the rest of Europe can already travel freely by showing a vaccine certificate?" Mr. Johnson described the question as a welcome call for liberty from the opposition benches and added, "I can tell him we have one of the most open travel systems in the world in the passenger locator form. I understand his grievance against it, we are certainly reviewing it." The travel hub has seen a huge downturn in passenger numbers since the pandemic began. Image, PA. 1813. Anthony Thrower. PM refuses to be drawn on reintroduction of testing and self-isolation if infection numbers rise. Labour MP Geraint Davies asked the PM at what point would the requirement for self-testing be reintroduced should the R rating rise. He said, "The Prime Minister says this is a scientific decision, so can he remind the House what the current R rate is, the infection rate? What is projected to be by the start of May, and at what level of R rate is he willing to reintroduce testing and self-isolation?" The Prime Minister replied, "As I have said earlier on, the rate of infections is falling and so are hospitalizations." 1804. Key event. Requirement to wear face coverings on TfL network to be removed. Sadiq Khan. Sadiq Khan said he expects rules on wearing face coverings on the Transport for London network will be lifted following the government's announcements. Following the government dropping all legal COVID restrictions, and in light of falling infection levels in London, it is expected that wearing a face covering will no longer be a condition of carriage on the TfL network, he said. However, we know that face coverings remain a simple, effective measure that give Londoners confidence to travel, and following clear advice from public health advisors, TfL will likely continue to recommend their use on the network. I urge passengers to be considerate of their fellow Londoners and continue to wear a face covering where appropriate unless exempt. Mr. Khan also said in order for restrictions to be lifted in the safest possible way, the government must rethink its plans to abandon free testing as well as ensuring financial support for those that cannot work from home if they test positive. We cannot have a situation where only the well-off can afford to live with COVID safely, or one where we're not keeping an eye on new variants posing a risk to the country, he said. 1756. Anthony Thrower. PM. Clinically vulnerable will have access to free testing. Responding to a question from Labour's Karen Smith, Boris Johnson assured the House vulnerable people will have access to testing. He added, "For the 1.3 million clinically extremely vulnerable, they will of course be given access to testing, free testing, and they will also have access to the largest quantity of antivirals and therapeutics per head of any European population." The PM earlier said it will be up to the NHS to determine its testing regime once free universal testing ends. 1733. Anthony Thrower. Entertainment venues welcome end of COVID-10 restrictions. The live music industry says the lifting of COVID restrictions is a huge, welcome relief to the sector which lost billions during the pandemic. Greg Parmley, chief executive of Live, which represents music industry venues and the entertainment sector including companies, artists and backstage workers, said, "The end of COVID-19 restrictions represents a huge, welcome relief to the live music sector, which lost billions in revenue throughout the pandemic. But with spiraling costs and thousands of companies struggling with pandemic debt, it's crucial that government does not abandon and set the sector adrift, just as it starts to tread water again. 1724. Anthony Thrower, Starmer. PM weakening sick pay will hit lowest paid and insecure workers the hardest. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the PM's living with COVID plans remove self-isolation support payments and weaken sick pay. He said, "These are decisions which will hit the lowest paid and the most insecure workers the hardest. We can't turn off Britain's radar before the war is won. Ignorance is bliss is not a responsible approach to a deadly virus. It actually risks undoing all the hard-won progress the British people have achieved over the last 2 years." The PM replied, "The evidence for ending COVID restrictions in England is amply there in the scientific evidence." 1708. Anthony Thrower, Starmer. PM's plan is yet more chaos and disarray. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the PM's plan for living with COVID is yet more chaos and disarray and does not prepare the UK for more variants. He said the Labour Party does not want to see restrictions in place for any longer, but said he was sure the British public would continue testing in isolating IF testing positive. Asking why free testing was being removed, he added, "If you're 2-1 up with 10 minutes to go, you don't take off your best defender." 1657. Anthony Thrower, PM. Vast cost of COVID measures topped £15 billion. The PM told MPs the test, trace and isolation budget in 2020-21 exceeded the entire budget of the Home Office. It cost a further £15.7 billion in this financial year and £2 billion in January alone at the height of the Omicron wave. 1653. Anthony Thrower, PM. It is time we got our confidence back. The PM has told MPs COVID will not suddenly disappear and said if the country was to wait until it is completely gone, restrictions would be in place for a long time to come. He added the government did not think it was right or necessary to hold restrictions in place. Image. Sky. 1647. Anthony Thrower, PM. Free universal COVID testing to end on April 1st. Free universal testing will end in England on April 1st, Boris Johnson has told MPs. He says the UK must now scale back testing, but that the UK will have the ability to ramp up testing in the NHS should the need arise. He added science advisors are certain there will be future new variants. 1643. Key event. PM. Requirement to isolate after positive COVID test to end this week. The PM says from Thursday people who test positive for COVID in England will not have to isolate as before. The legal requirement ends in just a few days' time and means those who test positive will still be advised to stay at home for at least 5 days, but will not be obliged to under law as part of the living with COVID plans. Routine contact tracing, self-isolation payments and the legal obligation for individuals to tell their employers about their requirement to isolate will also end Thursday. 1641. Anthony Thrower, PM starts briefing by sending best wishes to the Queen. Boris Johnson has started today's update on COVID restrictions by sending his best wishes to the Queen, who tested positive on Sunday. Her Majesty is suffering mild, cold-like symptoms after reporting a positive test. The PM said, "I know the whole House will join me in sending our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen for a full and swift recovery." He added the Queen's positive COVID test is a reminder the virus has not gone away. 1637. Anthony Thrower, Boris Johnson set to give COVID statement to Commons. The Prime Minister has arrived and is set to present the government's Living with COVID plan, where he is expected to update MPs on the ending of coronavirus. 1617. Anthony Thrower, UK reports 38,409 new COVID cases. Ahead of the Prime Minister's statement to the Commons expected shortly, official figures have shown the UK reported 38,409 new COVID-19 cases on Monday, with 15 deaths within 28 days of a positive test. Sunday's figures were reported as 25,696 cases and 74 deaths. 1542. Key event. Boris Johnson's statement pushed back. Ben Wallace, the defense secretary, is currently addressing the Commons about the situation in Ukraine. Boris Johnson's statement to the House has been pushed back to 4:30 p.m. His press conference is likely to begin at 7 p.m. 15:37. Milo Boyd. TUC says sick pay changes will leave workers with major dilemma. Mr. Johnson is said to be considering scrapping statutory sick pay from day one of testing positive for coronavirus. The £96.35 a week statutory sick pay (SSP) is usually only available from the fourth day of any illness. Kate Bell, of the TUC, said the changes would leave many workers with a major issue over choosing whether to self-isolate with COVID or not. If they have got COVID, they want to be able to stay at home without facing a terrible choice about whether that means losing income for a week, and they want to keep their colleagues safe and the other people they work with safe too, she said. That shouldn't be a choice that people are forced to make on their own. Meanwhile, TUC General Secretary Francis Agradi told the BBC's World at One that workers could not be expected to fork out themselves for tests. 15:33. Milo Boyd. Minister. We are not taking our eye off the ball with COVID plan. Energy Minister Greg Hands has said he supports Boris Johnson's living with COVID plan and dismissed claims that it was premature. He told the PA news agency, "We're looking forward to living with COVID. Going forward from here, how do we, if you like, normalize the situation? I am looking forward to the Prime Minister laying out his proposals this afternoon in the House of Commons." He added, "I think it's a balanced approach. Clearly we're not taking our eye off the ball, but equally there comes a time when you have to learn to live with COVID, and that's what today's proposals, I think, will be setting out how we do that." Image. PA. Don't miss. UK weather forecast. Met Office yellow warning for more 60 mph gales to smash Britain. Russia-Ukraine war live. Putin rips up key agreement and warns peace process is finished. Jamal Edwards died of a heart attack at home following DJ set at bar, friend says. UK weather forecast. Exact date: Storm Gladys will bring snow, wind and torrential rain. 15:11. Key event. 7 million people eligible for latest booster jab. More than 7 million people will be eligible for the booster jab. Health Secretary Sajid Javid said, "Following the JCVI's advice, I have asked the NHS to prepare to offer those eligible a vaccine from around 6 months after their last dose, and they will set out further details in due course. We know immunity to COVID-19 begins to wane over time. That's why we're offering a spring booster to those people at higher risk of serious COVID-19 too. Make sure they maintain a high level of protection. It's important that everyone gets their top-up jabs as soon as they're eligible." The JCVI will keep under review whether the booster program should be extended to further at-risk groups. 15:07. Milo Boyd. Number of free tests Brits can order is cut in 3. The number of lateral flow tests that can be ordered by Brits has been slashed in 3. Brits can now only order a box of lateral flow tests every 3 days after the government's website was updated. It used to be one box every 24 hours. Boris Johnson should soon provide some clarity as to the future of free tests. Boris Johnson wants to rein in government spending on lateral flow tests. Image. In pictures via Getty Images. 15:01. Key event. Over 75s and care home residents to be offered booster jabs this spring. People aged 75 and over, the immunosuppressed and those living in care homes will be offered a COVID-19 booster vaccine this spring, the health secretary has. Sajid Javid said the top-up jab would help those at the highest risk of serious COVID maintain a high level of protection against the virus. The NHS in England will offer people the jab from around 6 months after their last dose, with further details due to be set out shortly. Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are expected to make similar announcements after the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, JCVI, published UK-wide advice recommending the boosters. In interim guidance published for planning purposes, the JCVI said that a further dose for older people and those at risk is likely to be needed this autumn. Image. AFP via Getty Images. 14:36. Milo Boyd. Nicola Sturgeon dubs free test scrap plan as catastrophic. Another stern critic of the reported plans is Nicola Sturgeon. Scotland's First Minister criticised the apparent plans to scrap free tests. She said, "If this is correct, it's catastrophic for the UK's ability to ensure adequate COVID surveillance, outbreak management etc. in future. To allow significant dismantling of the testing infrastructure built up in last 2 years would be inexcusable negligence given ongoing risks." Image. Scottish Parliament. 1407. Key event. Almost half of Brits want COVID isolation requirements forever. According to a YouGov poll, the majority of the British public think that mandatory COVID isolation should continue. Only 17% of people backed an immediate end to isolation, with 48% saying it should be required always. Image. Arife Karakum, TNG. 1352. Milo Boyd. Full-time carer to disabled daughter slams negligent plan. For a certain section of society, ending COVID restrictions will have a huge impact on their lives. Lorna Fillingham, 50, is a full-time carer for her daughter and wheelchair user Emily May, who has physical and mental disabilities, and lives with Barrett-Winter syndrome, which affects the development of the brain, making her extremely vulnerable to COVID. Ms. Fillingham, who is based in Scunthorpe, North Lincolnshire, told the PA news agency, "I find it negligent, that is what I think it is. Johnson is neglecting the health of too many people, and I just don't understand why he is making this decision. I am all for freedom, don't get me wrong, but I cannot understand the timing of this announcement." The plans will affect the daily life of Ms. Fillingham and her family, who have been shielding since the country's first lockdown in March 2020. The family regularly call ahead to attractions to check they are not too busy before taking the children. "Every time we go somewhere, it's always going to be in the back of my head as to whether Emily May is safe in that environment or not," she said. "Because she could be sat next to somebody with active COVID, and she hasn't got the full protection of the vaccine."